Elvis Presley appeared on television more than almost any entertainer of his generation. From the moment he first walked onto a national broadcast in 1956, he understood what the camera could do for him. He used television to introduce himself to America, to rebuild his career after years away, and to connect with audiences who would never see him perform in person. By the time the 1970s arrived, his face had been on screen more times than most people could count. But there is one recorded performance that Elvis made sure stayed off the air. It was not a rumor. It was not a story that got passed around without any basis. The taping happened, the footage was recorded, and Elvis, after watching it back, personally made sure it was never broadcast. The people who were there remember it. Some of the footage has been seen by researchers and journalists over the years. It exists, and the story behind it says more about who Elvis was as a performer than almost anything else from that period of his life. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what television meant to Elvis. In January 1956, Elvis was still largely unknown outside the South. He had released a few records on Sun Records and had been building a following on the country circuit, but he had not yet broken through to a national audience. That changed when he appeared on Stage Show, a CBS program hosted by Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. Over the course of several appearances, a national audience got its first real look at him. What they saw was something they had not seen before. He moved differently than other performers. He sang differently. He connected with a crowd in a way that was immediate and physical and hard to explain. The Ed Sullivan appearances later that year made it permanent. Sullivan had initially said he would not book Elvis, calling him unfit for a family audience. Then Elvis appeared on a competing program, and the ratings were so strong that Sullivan changed his mind and signed him for 3 shows. The first broadcast drew an audience of around 60 million people. It was one of the largest television audiences in American history up to that point. After the third appearance, Sullivan told the audience on air that Elvis was a decent young man and that he had never had a pleasanter experience with a big name. That was not a small thing. Sullivan was not someone who handed out compliments easily. Elvis knew after those appearances what television could do. It could take a performer from regional to national in a single evening. It could shape how millions of people thought about you. It could build a version of you in the public mind that would last for decades. He also knew it could do the opposite. The 1968 NBC special, which most people refer to simply as the Comeback Special, is the clearest example of Elvis understanding how to use television on his own terms. By 1968, he had spent years making films that his fans tolerated but that critics dismissed. His records were still selling, but the cultural conversation had moved on to other artists. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, wanted the Christmas special to be a straightforward holiday program with Elvis singing seasonal songs in a tuxedo. Elvis and the show's producer, Steve Binder, had a different idea. What aired was raw and energetic and personal. Elvis sat in a small boxing ring-style stage, surrounded by fans, and played with a small group of musicians and talked between songs. He was present in a way he had not been on screen in years. The special was a commercial and critical success, and it restarted his recording career. He went into the studio shortly after and recorded some of the strongest material of his adult career. That special worked because Elvis was in control of what people saw. He knew what image he was projecting. He was comfortable with what was being put in front of the public. The performance that never aired was different. By the mid-1970s, Elvis's circumstances had changed significantly. He was performing regularly in Las Vegas and on touring schedules that covered dozens of cities a year. His health had been declining for several years. His weight had increased. He was dealing with prescription drug dependency that affected his energy and his focus. The people closest to him could see the changes clearly. The public, for the most part, was still buying tickets and still filling arenas. But a camera does not make allowances. A camera shows what is there. When Elvis watched the playback of that particular taping, he saw something he was not willing to put in front of an audience, and he made sure they never saw it. That decision and what led to it is what this story is about. The recording took place in 1974.
Elvis was 39 years old and had been performing at a pace that would have worn down almost anyone. He was doing multiple shows a week in Las Vegas, taking on touring schedules that covered city after city with very little time between dates, and recording when the schedule allowed. From the outside, the operation looked like a machine that was running smoothly. From the inside, the people around him could see that it was taking a toll. The specific taping in question was for a television broadcast meant to capture Elvis performing live. This was not an unusual arrangement for him at the time. He had done it before, and it had worked well. The 1973 satellite broadcast, Aloha from Hawaii, had been seen by an estimated audience of more than 1 billion people across multiple countries. It was a logistical achievement as much as a musical one, and it reinforced the idea that Elvis could deliver on a large stage when the cameras were rolling. The expectation going into the 1974 taping was that something similar could be produced. What the production team found when they arrived was a performer who was not in the condition they had hoped for. Elvis had been dealing with a range of health issues that had been building for several years. His weight had increased substantially from his peak physical period in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was being prescribed medication for a number of conditions, and the combination of those medications was affecting him in ways that were visible to anyone paying close attention. His energy levels were inconsistent. There were performances during this period where he was sharp and engaged, and the crowd left feeling they had seen something real. There were others where he was slower, more distant, working through the set without the focus that had defined him earlier in his career. The taping caught him on a bad night. From accounts of people who were present, Elvis appeared tired from the moment he arrived. The preparation that normally went into a performance, the focus and the ritual that his band and his crew had come to expect, felt different that evening. He was not as engaged in the hours leading up to the show. Those around him noticed, but there was not much that could be done at that point. The cameras were set up, the audience was in place, the broadcast arrangement had been made. The show was going to happen. When Elvis came on stage, the audience responded the way Elvis audiences always responded. The reaction was immediate and loud. For a performer who had been doing this for nearly 2 decades, that kind of reception was familiar, and they could carry a show even when the performer was not at full strength. Elvis had done it before. He had walked on stage when he wasn't feeling well and delivered a performance that satisfied a crowd simply on the strength of his presence and his experience. That night, it was not enough to hide what the camera was picking up. The physical changes were apparent on screen in a way they were not always apparent in a large arena where distance softened the details. Television is unforgiving in that way. A camera placed at the right angle in good lighting shows everything. Elvis's face looked puffy. His movements were slower than they had been. At certain points during the performance, he appeared to lose his place. Not dramatically, not in a way that stopped the show, but in small ways that a careful viewer would notice. He leaned on the microphone stand more than usual. There were moments where his energy dropped between songs. His voice was still there. That is worth saying clearly. Even in the difficult years, Elvis's voice retained qualities that most singers never develop in their entire careers. The range, the tone, the ability to reach something emotional in a lyric, those things did not disappear. On recordings from this period, you can still hear what made him singular as a vocalist, but the voice alone could not carry what the camera was capturing about the rest of him. The people running the production kept the cameras rolling. Their job was to record what was happening, and they did. The audience in the room had a good time. The show finished. Elvis left the stage. Then, someone put the footage on a monitor so Elvis could watch it back. That was the moment everything changed. What he saw when he looked at that screen was not what he was willing to show the world, and once he saw it, he made his position clear to everyone in the room. Elvis watched the footage in a back room after the performance ended. The people with him included members of his inner circle, some of the production staff, and a few of the crew who had been involved in setting up the taping. It was not an unusual arrangement. After a significant recording or broadcast, it was common for the relevant parties to review what had been captured and discuss whether it met the standard required for release. What was unusual was what happened when Elvis saw himself on the screen. He did not say much at first. People who were present have described him sitting quietly and watching. That silence, for those who knew him well, was not a neutral thing. Elvis was not a quiet person by nature. He talked, he joked, he filled rooms with his energy and his personality even when he was tired. When he went quiet in a serious situation, the people around him understood that something was wrong. He watched for several minutes. Then he made it clear that the footage was not going to air. The exact words vary depending on who is telling the story. What is consistent across the accounts is the substance of what he communicated. He did not want the public to see it. He did not think it represented him as a performer. He was not willing to have that version of himself broadcast into homes across the country. The decision was not presented as a request. It was stated as a fact. The footage would not air. That was the end of the discussion as far as Elvis was concerned. The people in the room understood what that meant practically. A television broadcast had been arranged. There were contractual and logistical considerations involved. Pulling the footage created problems that would need to be worked out. But Elvis's position was not open to negotiation, and the people closest to him knew better than to push back on something he felt this strongly about. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was not always present for moments like this one, but his influence was always in the background of any decision that involved Elvis's public image and his commercial arrangements. Parker had spent decades managing what the public saw and did not see. He understood the business side of Elvis's career better than almost anyone, and he also understood that Elvis's image was the foundation of everything. A performance that showed Elvis at a low point, broadcast to a national audience, could do real damage to that image and to the commercial operation that depended on it. Whatever Parker's specific involvement in the decision to suppress the footage, the outcome aligned with how he had always approached the management of Elvis's public presence. The network and the production team complied. The broadcast did not happen. The official explanation, to the extent that one was given publicly, was vague. These things happened in the television business. Specials got delayed or canceled for various reasons. The audience that had been expecting to see the broadcast did not get a detailed accounting of why it was pulled. What is significant is that the footage was not destroyed. In the entertainment business, when someone powerful wants something buried, the most complete way to do that is to make sure the physical material no longer exists. Films have been burned, recordings have been wiped, masters have been destroyed. Elvis had the standing and the influence in 1974 to demand that the tapes be erased. He did not do that, or if he did, the instruction was not fully carried out. The footage survived. There are a few possible explanations for that. One is that Elvis's objection was to the broadcast, not to the existence of the footage. He did not want the public to see it, but he may not have thought through or cared about what happened to the tapes themselves once the decision to pull the broadcast was made. Another possibility is that the production company retained copies as a matter of standard practice, and those copies stayed in an archive without anyone making a deliberate decision to preserve or destroy them. What is clear is that after the broadcast was canceled, the footage moved into a kind of institutional storage. It was not circulated. It was not talked about publicly in the years immediately following. For a while, it was simply one of those things that the people involved knew about and the public did not. Elvis went back on the road. He continued performing. He continued recording. The public continued filling arenas and buying records. But the tapes were still there. And eventually, people would start asking questions about them. The footage did not stay hidden forever. Over the years, as researchers and journalists began working through the archives of Elvis's career, the taping came up. Not loudly, and not in a way that produced a major public controversy, but enough that people with access to the relevant materials were able to see what Elvis had refused to let air. What they described when they talked about it was consistent enough across different accounts to give a reasonably clear picture of what is on those tapes. What the footage shows, above everything else, is a man who was aware that something was wrong with him. That is the detail that stands out most in the accounts of people who have seen it. Not the physical changes, though those are visible. Not the moments where his energy drops or his movements slow down. What stands out is that Elvis knew. You can see it in the way he carries himself on stage. There is a self-consciousness to the performance that was not typical of him.
Elvis at his best was completely unself-conscious as a performer. He moved and sang and connected with the crowd in a way that suggested he was not thinking about how he looked or what the camera was capturing. That ease, that comfort in his own body on a stage was one of the things that made him so compelling to watch. In this footage, that ease is gone. He's aware of the camera in a way that works against him. He's trying to manage what is being recorded rather than simply performing. For someone with his experience and his instincts, that kind of self-monitoring is almost worse than the physical issues themselves because it shows up in everything. The naturalness that defined his best performances is replaced by something more careful and more guarded, and a camera picks that up immediately. The physical details that the footage captures are consistent with what was being documented about Elvis's health during this period by the people around him. His weight at this point in his life was significantly higher than it had been during his peak years. His face showed the effects of the medications he was taking. His stamina during the performance was not what it had been. These are not judgments, they are descriptions of what the footage contains, based on accounts from people who have reviewed it. What makes the footage historically significant is not that it shows Elvis having a bad night. Every performer has bad nights. What makes it significant is the context. This was 1974. Elvis had 3 years left to live. The health problems that are visible in this footage were not going to improve. They were going to get worse. The taping captures a moment in a trajectory, and knowing where that trajectory ended gives the footage a weight that it would not otherwise carry. It also raises a question that people who have studied Elvis's life have returned to many times. How much did Elvis understand about what was happening to him? The decision to pull the footage suggests a level of self-awareness that is sometimes absent from accounts of his final years. There's a version of the story of Elvis's decline that presents him as someone who was insulated from reality by the people around him, someone who did not fully understand how serious his situation had become because no one close to him was willing to tell him directly. That version has some truth to it. The people in his circle had complicated reasons for not confronting him, and the structure of his life made honest conversations difficult. But a man who watches a recording of himself and immediately decides that the public cannot see it is not someone who is completely unaware of his own condition. He saw something in that footage that he recognized as a problem. He understood what it would communicate to an audience, and he acted on that understanding clearly and decisively. That is a different kind of portrait than the one that gets painted most often when people discuss Elvis in his final years. The footage also matters because of what it preserves. Elvis Presley was one of the most documented performers in history, but documentation is not the same as the full picture. The recordings and the films and the photographs that were released during his lifetime were curated. They were selected by Elvis, by his management, by the people who controlled what the public saw. What was left out of that curated record is part of the story too. This taping is part of what was left out. It survived because no one destroyed it. It matters because it is real, and it tells a part of the story of Elvis Presley that the official record was never going to tell on its own.